When my uncle's message arrived, I was exhausted from another draining day at work, eager only to lose myself in my evening routine. My phone vibrated sharply, the screen lighting up with Uncle Ray's name. Odd, he wasn't one to send random messages. Even stranger was the message itself. "You need to see this, Allie. I'm so sorry." My curiosity mixed with unease as I tapped the video, unsure of what awaited me. The scene was instantly recognizable. My parents' backyard, a sunny weekend, family members scattered casually around. But my attention zeroed in on my sister Amber, reclining in a lawn chair, a drink casually held, her face twisted into a smug smile. Amber's voice pierced through the laughter-filled background noise. "Please, Allie's never gonna kick me out. She's too clueless. I've been living there rent-free for years." She sipped her drink, eyes sparkling with amusement. "Honestly, it's hilarious. She believes every sob story I spin. Poor Ally, always the fool." The laughter that followed wasn't just Amber's, it echoed from others, including my cousin Mark, Amber's best friend Lisa, and even my dad. My chest tightened, a cold sensation settling in my stomach as I watched again. Each replay felt harsher, her mocking tone sharpening into a weapon against my dignity. Amber had been living in my home for 3 years. It began when her life spiraled, a devastating breakup, loss of employment, eviction looming. She'd cried on the phone, pleading, "Just a few months, Ally. I promise I'll get back on track." And I'd opened my door without hesitation, driven by the need to protect my sister. But that few months had quietly stretched into years, and Amber's temporary stay morphed into entitlement. Now, seeing her openly mocking my kindness, her contempt felt unbearable. I stared blankly at the screen, each replay of the video driving the dagger deeper into my trust. Anger surged but quickly cooled into something deeper: determination. This wasn't just about anger, it was about reclaiming my dignity. Uncle Ray's message popped up again, almost apologetic. "I didn't want to cause trouble, but you deserved to know." Without hesitation, I replied firmly, "Thanks. Please don't tell her I've seen this. I'll handle it." That night, sleep evaded me as plans formed clearly, calmly. Confronting Amber directly would be too simple. She deserved to experience the shock of realizing her cozy world was about to collapse, just as she'd shattered mine. The next morning felt surreal, the early sunlight streaming into my kitchen as Amber strolled in without a care, stretching dramatically. "Morning," she chirped, pouring herself coffee without bothering to ask. "Morning," I replied evenly, hiding my disgust behind a practiced smile. She launched into her usual complaints about work stress, oblivious to the storm quietly building within me. "Honestly, Ally, I don't know how I'd cope without your place. Rent is just insane." I swallowed the urge to explode, choosing instead to maintain my composure. "Speaking of," I began casually, stirring my coffee slowly, "what are your plans going forward?" Amber's brows furrowed slightly, confusion dancing across her face. "Plans?" I nodded calmly. "Well, you've been here 3 years rent-free. Have you thought about your next step? Maybe it's time you started looking at places of your own." Her laugh was immediate and dismissive. "Please, Ally. Moving is the last thing I have time for right now. And it's crazy expensive." The nerve. I fought back the laughter rising bitterly in my chest. I'd seen her designer clothes, overheard her lavish plans, knew exactly how much she made. "Interesting," I said, keeping my voice casual, "because starting next month, you'll need to start paying rent." Amber froze mid-sip, coffee mug halfway to her lips. Her smile wavered briefly before she forced a laugh. "You're joking, right?" "No," I answered calmly. "It's fair. You have a good job. You should be contributing." Her shock quickly turned into irritation. "Come on, Ally. We're family. Family doesn't charge rent." I raised an eyebrow, holding her gaze without flinching. "Family doesn't mock each other behind their backs either, yet here we are." Her expression tightened. A flash of something darker, uncertainty, panic, crossing her features. But she quickly masked it with indignation. "I was just joking around, Ally. You're really gonna punish me for that?" $1,200 a month, I said calmly, sipping my coffee. "That's below market rate. A fair deal." Amber shook her head in disbelief, eyes wide. "You're kidding. You're seriously going to do this to me?" "No," I clarified firmly. "You did this to yourself." Silence settled thickly between us, filled with tension. Amber set her coffee down sharply, her confidence wavering visibly. "Fine. We'll see about that." She stormed out, slamming the door. As her footsteps faded, I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. Amber needed to understand that the time for manipulation was over, and a new chapter had begun. A chapter written on my terms. Amber thought she still had control. She thought this was just a passing storm, that I'd relent like always. But she couldn't have been more wrong. This was just the beginning, and by the end, Amber would learn exactly what happens when you underestimate someone you've been taking advantage of for too long. The following morning, I woke from part 1. You helped me create new content with 1,000 words. Note the standard number of words. Attractive, creative, engaging content, different characters and contexts, but still ensure 70% difference from the original content, not violating YouTube copyright. Do not write with Canva form, up early, feeling surprisingly calm despite the storm brewing inside me. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt brighter somehow, sharper, illuminating a truth I'd long ignored. Amber had been taking advantage of my kindness, turning it into a weakness. Now, finally, I was determined to reclaim my strength. I brewed coffee slowly, deliberately, the comforting aroma filling my kitchen as I mentally rehearsed my plan. Amber wouldn't see this coming. She was used to an accommodating version of me, someone easily manipulated by guilt and familial obligation. But that version was gone. Amber sauntered into the kitchen moments later, wearing an oversized robe and yawning dramatically. She grabbed a mug from the cabinet without asking, pouring herself coffee and splashing milk carelessly onto the counter. Typical Amber, always assuming I'd clean up after her. "Morning," she muttered, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Good morning," I replied softly, maintaining my composure as I watched her carelessly sip from my favorite mug. I swallowed my irritation and took a calming breath. "Sleep well?" Amber nodded, stretching leisurely. "Oh yeah, like a baby. Your guest room bed is honestly amazing." "Glad to hear it," I responded calmly. I studied her closely, noting the casual entitlement in her every movement. She acted as if the house was hers, as if my generosity was simply expected. It was infuriating, but my face remained carefully neutral. Amber rambled on about her work stress and how demanding her job had become. I nodded politely, feigning interest while my mind remained focused on the next step. Timing was everything. I couldn't rush it. Amber needed to feel the gradual realization that things were changing. Finally, as Amber took another leisurely sip of coffee, I casually shifted the conversation. "So, Amber," I started gently, leaning against the counter, "have you thought any more about your future plans?" She glanced at me blankly, as if the question was absurd. "Future plans? Like what specifically?" I smiled softly, keeping my tone even. "I mean, you've been here quite a long time. Have you considered finding your own place? Maybe making a move soon?" Amber's expression flickered with mild annoyance. "Seriously, ally? You're bringing this up again?" "It's just a conversation," I replied smoothly, ignoring her irritation. "I think it's a good time to start planning." Amber laughed dismissively. "Honestly, Allie, moving is the absolute last thing I need to deal with right now. Work is crazy, everything's expensive, and I've got too much going on to even think about it." "That's understandable," I conceded lightly, tapping my fingers against my coffee mug thoughtfully. "But 3 years is a long time. Maybe it's fair that we reconsider our arrangement." Amber frowned slightly, sensing something deeper beneath my calm demeanor. "What do you mean? Reconsider?" "Well," I began casually, my voice relaxed but firm, "I think it's reasonable that starting next month you contribute toward the household expenses, rent, bills. You know, the usual things most adults cover." Amber's jaw tightened visibly, and for a brief moment her easygoing mask slipped. "Wait, you're serious? You're actually expecting me to pay rent?" "Why wouldn't I be serious?" I asked evenly. "You've lived here rent-free for years. It's fair, isn't it?" Amber shook her head incredulously, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Come on, ally, we're sisters. You're really going to nickel and dime family?" I met her gaze directly, unwavering. "Family respects each other's generosity, Amber. They don't mock it." Her eyes widened briefly in shock, then narrowed defensively. "Mock it? What are you talking about?" "Just saying," I continued calmly, careful not to reveal my knowledge of her betrayal. "Maybe it's time to establish clearer boundaries. It's healthier for both of us." Amber's expression flickered with uncertainty, then shifted quickly to indignation. Wow, Allie, you've really changed. I shrugged slightly, keeping my voice steady. Maybe. Or maybe I've just finally realized what I deserve. Amber scoffed, clearly irritated. She abruptly set her coffee cup down, almost spilling it. Whatever. We'll talk about this later. She turned and marched out of the kitchen, leaving her mess behind. I watched her go, feeling oddly calm despite the tension. Amber wasn't used to resistance, wasn't used to boundaries. She'd lived comfortably off my kindness, assuming it would last forever. But now she was faced with the reality that her free ride had an expiration date. Throughout the day, Amber avoided me, clearly unsettled by our morning conversation. She stayed hidden in her room, blasting music loudly, as if trying to drown out the implications of my words. But the truth had already settled between us like a silent challenge, impossible to ignore. By evening, the house felt charged with quiet tension. Amber emerged briefly, offering clipped, superficial conversation, careful to avoid the topic of rent. I watched her silently, sensing the shift in our dynamic, the balance tipping in my favor for the first time in years. Later that night, I sat alone in the quiet living room, reflecting on the day's events. It wasn't anger that filled me, nor regret. It was empowerment. For too long, I'd allowed Amber to dictate the terms of our relationship, silently accepting disrespect. But no longer. As midnight approached, a text buzzed on my phone. It was Uncle Ray. Everything all right? I smiled softly, typing a quick response. Better than ever. He replied instantly, supportive and reassuring. Good. Remember, setting boundaries is self-care. His words resonated deeply, strengthening my resolve. Amber may not yet fully understand the shift in our dynamic, but she would soon. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by mutual respect, fairness, and my newfound strength. Amber had underestimated me, but she was about to discover just how much I'd grown. Over the next few days, Amber's presence around the house grew increasingly tense. Every casual interaction seemed charged, the air thick with an unspoken conflict simmering beneath the surface. She moved carefully, cautiously, aware that our dynamic had shifted, but uncertain how far I was willing to push. I, meanwhile, felt strangely liberated. Each moment of awkward silence between us only strengthened my resolve. It was time Amber recognized that our arrangement was no longer sustainable or fair. Finally, after days of avoidance, Amber confronted me head-on. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through a novel, when she stormed in without warning, her eyes blazing with frustration. "We need to talk," she snapped, folding her arms defiantly. I calmly closed my book, setting it gently aside. "All right, let's talk." Amber took a sharp breath, clearly agitated. "Are you actually serious about charging me rent? After everything? After 3 whole years? I maintained a steady gaze, refusing to show any sign of wavering. "Absolutely. Why shouldn't I be serious?" Her expression twisted into disbelief. "Because we're family. You've never asked before, and suddenly, after all this time, you're pulling this?" I leaned back slightly, keeping my voice steady and composed. "Amber, I've supported you unconditionally for years. But you're stable now. You have a good income, yet you contribute nothing. It's reasonable and overdue for you to start taking responsibility." Amber scoffed bitterly, shaking her head. "Responsibility? Wow, you really are going there. I thought family meant something to you." I allowed a silence to linger, the weight of my words sinking in before I responded. "Family means mutual respect, Amber. It doesn't mean letting someone take advantage indefinitely." She paced furiously, frustration radiating from every tense movement. Her eyes darted, clearly searching for a weak spot in my argument. "So what happens if I refuse to pay? Are you going to kick me out, your own sister?" I regarded her calmly, unshaken by the threat. "I don't want it to come to that. But yes, if necessary, I will." Amber's mouth fell open, a mix of shock and anger crossing her face. "I can't believe you're even saying this. You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I asked quietly, my tone steady and confident. "What's ridiculous is allowing you to continue living here rent-free while you openly mock my generosity." Amber paused, clearly taken aback, suspicion flickering briefly in her eyes. "Mock your generosity? What are you even talking about?" I took a careful breath, measuring my words deliberately. "You know exactly what I mean. You've never appreciated what I've done for you. You treat my home as if you're entitled to it. That stops now." Her eyes narrowed, irritation bubbling over. "You're exaggerating. I've always been grateful." Have you? I challenged, keeping my voice low yet firm. Because I've never once heard a thank you. Instead, I've seen entitlement, disrespect, and dismissal of my kindness as if it's a joke. Amber's expression tightened, uncertainty mingling with resentment. That's not true, she muttered defensively, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the truth she desperately tried to deny. Amber. I continued calmly, refusing to give her room to maneuver. For 3 years, you've lived comfortably, benefiting from my generosity without a thought. Now I'm asking you to simply do your part, and you act as though I've wronged you. Amber glared at me, anger flashing in her eyes. I can't afford what you're asking. You know that. I leaned forward, keeping eye contact unbroken. You can, you just don't want to. There's a difference. She faltered momentarily, the truth stinging visibly as it sank in. But pride quickly masked it, and she resorted again to defiance. Fine. If you're determined to treat me like a stranger, I'll just find somewhere else. That's your choice, I responded calmly, betraying no hint of disappointment or relief. But understand this, my asking you to pay rent isn't a punishment. It's about respect, boundaries, and fairness. Amber scoffed again, attempting to reclaim some control over the situation. Respect and fairness, huh? Seems more like power games to me. I shook my head gently, a slight sadness seeping into my tone. This isn't a game, Amber. It's life. It's adulthood. It's responsibility. All things you've avoided by leaning on me. Amber opened her mouth as if to fire back, then paused, the words dying unspoken. A realization flickered briefly across her face. Recognition of the uncomfortable truth in my words. But pride quickly pushed it aside. You know what? Fine, she snapped bitterly, turning away abruptly. I'll figure something out. I watched her storm off, leaving behind a tense silence that settled heavily in the room. Despite the conflict, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Finally, I had stood my ground. Amber was unsettled, confused, and perhaps even frightened by my newfound resolve, but it was necessary. That night, alone in my quiet house, I contemplated the exchange. It wasn't easy confronting Amber, drawing lines after years of permissiveness. Yet, as difficult as it was, the weight I'd carried for so long felt lighter. A quiet knock at my door startled me from my reflections. Uncle Ray stood on the porch, his eyes gentle with concern. Hey, he said softly, just checking in. I sighed, offering a small smile as I stepped aside to let him in. It wasn't easy, I admitted quietly. He nodded knowingly, his gaze warm and reassuring. Doing the right thing rarely is, but you deserve respect, ally, even if Amber doesn't see it yet. I took a deep breath, absorbing his supportive words. Thanks, Uncle Ray. He placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, his presence calming the lingering anxiety. You've taken the hardest step. She'll understand eventually, and if she doesn't, well, at least you've respected yourself enough to demand better. As he spoke, a comforting certainty settled within me. Amber might never fully appreciate or understand my actions, but for the first time in years, I felt true peace, a peace born from finally standing up for myself. Amber disappeared for the next several days, her absence noticeable yet unsurprising. Her typical carefree attitude had vanished, replaced by a tense silence that filled the empty rooms of the house. Each day that passed only reaffirmed my resolve. I'd drawn a clear line, and now Amber had to choose which side she would stand on. I busied myself with routine tasks, finding unexpected comfort in the simplicity of daily life. There was a strange peace in knowing that I was reclaiming control of my home and my life from Amber's careless grasp. Then, on a quiet Saturday morning, everything shifted once more. Amber returned abruptly, slamming the front door behind her, her eyes blazing with fury. She threw her bag onto the couch, her frustration palpable as she confronted me in the kitchen. "What is this?" she demanded, thrusting her phone toward me, her hand trembling slightly with anger. I glanced calmly at the screen, recognizing the email instantly. A formal lease agreement from the property management company I'd hired. Exactly what it says. A lease agreement. Amber's jaw dropped incredulously. A lease agreement? Are you serious right now? Yes, I said evenly, holding her gaze. You made it clear you wouldn't pay rent voluntarily, so I formalized the arrangement. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. This is ridiculous, Allie. Completely unnecessary. I can't believe you'd go this far. I had no choice, I responded calmly, refusing to be rattled by her anger. You gave me none. Amber's eyes narrowed sharply, her tone shifting to a bitter mockery. Oh, so now you're the victim? I'm the bad sister who's taking advantage of you? Amber, think about it objectively, I challenged gently but firmly. You've lived here rent-free for years while earning a good salary. Isn't it fair that you finally start paying your share? Fair? She shot back, her voice rising sharply. You call surprising me with a formal lease fair? We're family, Ally, not landlord and tenant. I sighed, maintaining a steady composure. You turned it into this, Amber. You forced my hand when you refused to acknowledge how one-sided this arrangement had become. Amber paced angrily, frustration etched into every step she took. She finally stopped, spinning to face me again, her voice quieter but filled with hurt. Why didn't you at least talk to me before going this far? Because every conversation we had ended with you dismissing me, I explained firmly. I had to make it official so you'd finally understand how serious I am. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair in disbelief. Ally, I never thought you'd do something like this to me. It wasn't an easy decision, I admitted truthfully. But it was necessary. You haven't respected me or my home. Now it's time for clear boundaries. Amber shook her head, her voice trembling slightly. I can't afford this right now. You know how tight my budget is. Amber, I replied gently, you have the means. I've heard you talk about your lavish trips and expensive outings. You can afford this, you're just unwilling to prioritize it. Her eyes widened, clearly startled that I knew about her lifestyle. Quickly masking her surprise, she fired back defensively. That's none of your business. It is when it affects me, I countered firmly. Your choices impact my life directly, and it's time you took accountability. Amber hesitated, seemingly caught between anger and realization. She finally let out a frustrated sigh. Fine. You win, Ally. You've made your point, but you didn't need to humiliate me with a formal lease. I wasn't trying to humiliate you, I clarified softly. I just needed you to see how serious I am about this. Amber remained silent for a long moment, clearly processing everything I'd said. Her anger slowly transformed into something deeper, perhaps genuine regret, or maybe just acceptance. Finally, she sighed heavily. What if I refuse to sign this? Are you going to kick me out onto the streets? I met her eyes evenly, my voice calm and unwavering. If you refuse, Amber, then I'll follow the standard legal procedures. You'll receive a notice to vacate, and if you ignore that, then yes, eviction becomes the next step. She stared at me, disbelief clouding her eyes. You'd really evict your own sister? It's not something I want to do, I admitted honestly, the weight of my words clear. But if you force me into that position, I won't back down. Amber's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight visibly draining from her. She sank down into a kitchen chair, looking genuinely lost. I don't know what to do, Ally. Amber, I said gently, stepping closer, it doesn't have to be this difficult. Just acknowledge the situation and take responsibility. It's time. She looked up, vulnerability briefly flickering through her tough facade. This is just so sudden. I didn't expect any of this. You've had plenty of warning, I reminded her gently but firmly. You've chosen to ignore every sign because it was convenient for you. But convenience doesn't mean fairness. Amber sat silently, clearly wrestling internally. After several long moments, she finally looked up, determination returning to her eyes. All right, I'll sign the lease. Relief flooded through me, but I kept my composure. Good. I think this will ultimately be better for both of us. Amber stood slowly, clearly drained but accepting of the new reality. I still think you're overreacting, but fine, I'll play by your rules. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her reluctant acceptance. That's all I'm asking for. Respect and fairness. Amber sighed once more, picking up her phone and scrolling through the lease again. When's my first payment due? The 1st of next month, I replied calmly. That gives you time to prepare. She glanced at me one final time, her expression still conflicted but resigned. Without another word, she left the kitchen quietly, retreating to her room. I stood alone, a strange peace settling over me. It wasn't a victory or a defeat. It was simply balance restored. Amber had been forced to see reality clearly. And for the first time in years, the weight of her choices rested squarely on her shoulders. Not mine. Amber's agreement to the lease did little to ease the growing tension in our household. Days passed slowly, and while outwardly calm, Beneath the surface, I felt Amber's resentment festering quietly. She interacted with cold politeness, each glance laced with subtle hostility, each brief exchange loaded with unsaid grievances. One afternoon, while preparing lunch, Amber abruptly entered the kitchen, her expression dark and serious. She placed her phone down firmly on the counter, facing me squarely. "I've looked at the lease again," she began sharply, folding her arms tightly, "and I still don't think it's fair." I glanced up, meeting her defiant gaze calmly. "We've discussed this already, Amber. It's more than fair, considering the circumstances." Her eyes flashed irritably, a simmering anger finally surfacing. "You're acting like I've deliberately taken advantage of you. It wasn't intentional." I paused, setting aside the salad I'd been tossing, giving her my full attention. "Intentional or not, the outcome is the same. You relied on my generosity without any regard for how it impacted me." Amber's jaw tightened visibly. "You make it sound malicious. I've always appreciated your help." "Have you?" I challenged softly, my voice steady but firm. Appreciation usually comes with respect, consideration, or at least gratitude. Mocking me behind my back wasn't appreciation. She shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away briefly. "That was a mistake, ally. I said things I shouldn't have, but forcing a lease on me, threatening eviction, is extreme." "Amber," I said, gentle but unwavering, "I didn't force anything on you. I offered you options. You chose this path because you refused to consider any other." She shook her head, clearly frustrated, pacing the small space. "Fine. Maybe I've made some mistakes, but you know me. You know I have trouble managing stuff like this." Her tone softened, shifting from anger to vulnerability, a tactic she'd used countless times to sway me before. But this time, it wouldn't work. "You're capable, Amber," I replied, kindness coloring my firmness. "You have a good job, a steady income. Managing your responsibilities is part of being an adult." Amber exhaled heavily, staring at the floor, momentarily speechless. When she finally spoke again, bitterness tinged her words. "And if I can't pay? If something happens?" I considered her question calmly, knowing exactly where this conversation was headed. "Then we'll have to cross that bridge if we come to it. But I won't let you ignore your responsibilities anymore. It's not fair, to either of us." Amber's expression tightened again, anger resurfacing quickly. "You really think you're teaching me some kind of lesson, don't you?" I sighed gently, shaking my head. "No, this isn't about teaching you a lesson. It's about me finally setting boundaries and respecting myself. I've let you take advantage for far too long." She hesitated, visibly conflicted. Finally, her shoulders slumped slightly, a reluctant acknowledgement settling over her. "All right, fine, I'll pay the rent. But don't pretend you're not enjoying this just a little." I maintained a neutral expression, responding evenly. "I'm not enjoying this, Amber. This entire situation is painful, but sometimes pain is necessary for growth. Yours and mine." Amber studied my face carefully, searching for weakness or deception, but found none. Eventually she nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll handle it." Days passed, tense yet uneventful, until the first of the month arrived. Amber's anxiety was palpable, each movement around the house heavy with anticipation. That morning, she hesitated outside my bedroom door, clearly debating whether to speak or retreat silently. "What is it?" I asked softly, sensing her lingering presence. Amber stepped inside cautiously, her voice low and hesitant. "Look, I've transferred the rent. It's done." "Good," I replied calmly, showing neither victory nor relief, simply quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you." She stood awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the newfound dynamic. Finally, she broke the silence. "Things feel so different now, like strangers living together." "That's what happens when trust breaks down," I said gently but honestly. "We need time to rebuild it, if that's what we both want." Amber exhaled slowly, nodding. "I didn't expect things to change this much." "They had to," I reminded her gently. "It couldn't stay the way it was. We both deserve better." She glanced around the room, uncertainty clouding her expression. "So how do we move forward from here?" I took a deep breath, carefully choosing my words. "With honesty, respect, maybe even forgiveness, eventually. But first, you have to earn it." Amber's expression softened slightly, vulnerability breaking through her defenses. "You don't trust me at all anymore, do you?" I hesitated briefly, meeting her gaze honestly. "Not right now, but trust can be rebuilt, with effort." Amber nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of our new situation. "All right, I'll try. The following weeks were filled with subtle changes. Amber made genuine attempts to be considerate, quietly contributing to household chores without complaint, slowly adjusting to our new normal. Though tension lingered, a fragile peace began to settle over us. One evening, as I finished tidying the kitchen, Amber approached quietly, hesitant yet sincere. "Hey, Allie." "Yes?" I looked up, surprised by her subdued tone. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she admitted softly, the words clearly difficult for her. "For everything." Her vulnerability touched me deeply. I studied her face carefully, noting genuine regret in her expression. "Thank you. That means a lot." Amber smiled faintly, relief visible in her eyes. "I realize now that things couldn't keep going the way they were. I took advantage, and you deserved better." I nodded gently, feeling the weight of her apology ease some of the lingering resentment. "I appreciate you acknowledging that." She took a deep breath, her voice steadier now. "I'm trying to grow up. I'm trying to show you that I can be responsible. I'm serious this time." "I believe you?" That I said softly, truly meaning it for the first time in months. Amber's expression brightened slightly, cautiously optimistic. "Maybe someday we'll get past this. Really get past it." "Maybe," I agreed gently, "but let's take it one step at a time." She nodded again, quietly retreating from the kitchen. Left alone, I felt a cautious sense of hope. Change was difficult, messy, and uncomfortable, but maybe, just maybe, Amber was finally ready to embrace it. Perhaps, for the first time, we both were. The house felt different after Amber left, as though it had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Everything appeared brighter, clearer, more spacious, and yet an unexpected melancholy lingered. As relieved as I was to reclaim my home and my life, the quiet was something I hadn't anticipated. Amber's absence, though necessary, left a strange emptiness that echoed softly through the hallways. A few evenings after her departure, I found myself wandering from room to room, adjusting small things, straightening a pillow, rearranging furniture, cleaning surfaces that had long been neglected. Every action felt symbolic, like erasing remnants of Amber's influence. Slowly restoring order to a life I'd nearly forgotten was my own. Yet amid the satisfaction of reclaiming my space, there was a persistent ache. Amber wasn't just a problem I'd solved. She was my sister. Our bond, as strained as it had become, still held emotional weight. Each corner of the house held memories. Laughs, arguments, late-night conversations, moments of closeness that seemed impossibly distant now. Late one afternoon, I was sorting through old photos in the living room when a gentle knock sounded at the front door. I opened it to see Uncle Ray, a comforting presence whose gentle eyes conveyed quiet understanding. "Hey kid," he greeted softly, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "Come in," I said gratefully, stepping aside to let him pass. Ray glanced around appreciatively, nodding slowly as he took in the subtle changes. "Feels different already." "Better?" I asked tentatively, unsure of my own feelings. He smiled knowingly. "Different can be better, even when it feels complicated." We settled into the kitchen, sunlight filtering softly through the window, casting a calming glow across the room. Ray watched me carefully, reading the quiet conflict that I couldn't entirely hide. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, his voice full of compassion. I exhaled slowly, unsure how to articulate the complex emotions swirling within me. "I feel relieved, but also empty." "Is that strange?" Ray shook his head slightly, his eyes full of understanding. "Not at all. She's your sister. Cutting ties isn't easy, even when it's necessary." I nodded thoughtfully, running my fingers over the smooth surface of my coffee mug. "I wonder if I went too far." He leaned forward, his voice firm yet comforting. "You didn't. Amber needed this. She might not realize it yet, but you've given her something important, the chance to stand on her own." "Do you think she'll ever understand?" I asked, the vulnerability in my voice surprising even myself. Ray paused, considering carefully before answering. "Eventually, yes. Growth is messy, uncomfortable, and often painful. Amber may resent you right now, but she'll come to see this was the right thing." "I hope you're right." I sighed quietly, a slight sadness coloring my words. "You've always been the caretaker, Allie," Ray said softly. "But sometimes the strongest form of love is letting someone face their own battles." The wisdom in his words eased some of the lingering doubt, giving me a moment of clarity amidst the uncertainty. "Thanks, Ray. I needed to hear that." "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he assured me warmly. Never forget that. After Ray left, I found myself reflecting deeply. He was right. I'd spent years sacrificing my comfort, my space, and even my self-respect to keep Amber comfortable. But growth meant facing discomfort head-on for both of us. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. I felt myself gradually reclaiming my identity, rediscovering interests I'd long neglected. Cooking dinner felt lighter, quieter evenings offered a chance for introspection, and the solitude I'd initially feared became a comforting companion rather than a void. Yet thoughts of Amber still lingered, unshakable. I wondered how she was coping, whether she was managing her new life, or if resentment still clouded her perspective. Despite everything, part of me still wished for reconciliation, not to revert to our previous dynamic, but perhaps to build something healthier, more genuine. One evening, as I prepared dinner, my phone buzzed unexpectedly, breaking the quiet. My heart jumped slightly when I saw Amber's name appear. The message was simple yet meaningful. "Hey, settled into my new place? Just wanted to say thanks. I think I finally get it now." I stared at the screen, emotions swirling. Her acknowledgement, brief though it was, carried weight. It was a small but significant step toward healing, toward rebuilding a relationship that had become fractured by resentment and entitlement. I replied gently, "Glad to hear you're settling in. I hope this is the start of something better for both of us." A few moments passed before Amber's response came through. "Me too. Maybe we can talk soon, when you're ready." Relief filled me, along with cautious optimism. We both had a long way to go, but the bridge toward mutual respect had begun to form. Boundaries had allowed for honesty, and honesty had opened the door to forgiveness. That night, as I sat quietly on my porch, watching the stars gradually emerge in the evening sky, a sense of genuine peace enveloped me. For the first time in years, I felt entirely free. Not just from Amber's demands or manipulations, but from my own self-doubt, my insecurities, my willingness to let others define my value. I had finally chosen myself, and in doing so, I'd found the strength to help Amber truly grow. Our journey wasn't finished, nor would it be easy. But it was honest. And for now, that was enough. Amber and I might never return to how things once were, but maybe we could become something better. Perhaps with time and effort, we could rediscover our sisterhood, not through obligation or manipulation, but through genuine respect and love. As the gentle night breeze brushed past, I smiled softly, embracing the bittersweet beauty of change. The chapter that had defined my life for so long had finally closed, and a new one, filled with possibilities, healing, and self-respect, had just begun.